the days when the BBC are willing to lead the 10 o'clock news with a poll story are long since gone.
The guru, the GOAT, as he's often been called, the greatest of all time, the doyen of polling, Professor Sir John Curtice, star psephologist of Strathclyde, and plenty else besides. How are you, John?
Well, it's been busy. I guess, like lots of other people, I'm now looking forward to the end. And it's kind of almost inevitably the case that given people think they know what the result's going to be, a lot of the interest is moving away from what the polls are saying to what's going to happen after July the 4th.
So the big question that we're being asked a lot is, are there more polls than ever, and are they shaping the narrative of a campaign, dominating the narrative of the campaign more than ever? As you look back on all the campaigns you've covered and analysed, is that a fair comment?
It's certainly correct that there are more polls than ever. I think there are something like 16 companies who are polling during this election, and at least around 13, 14 of them every week, and indeed some cases twice a week. The barriers to entry into polling are now much lower. The cost of doing it is much lower because essentially they're done over the internet, so you don't have to employ interviewers either on the telephone, let alone face-to-face, and that's a long time ago since they've been done that way. So there are now many more players. Point one, are they dominating more than the past? Well, I mean, I certainly remember in 1992, when, of course, a lot of the discussion in the campaign was going to be about what might happen in the event of a hung parliament, because the polls looked as though they were pointing towards a hung parliament. In the event, of course, the polls were wrong, but certainly the polls dominated, and certainly in the wake of that, the BBC changed its editorial policy. And the days when the BBC are willing to lead the 10 o'clock news with a poll story are long since gone. And that essentially is a consequence of the experience of 1992 and John Burt, the then Director General, basically changing BBC editorial policy. Again, more recently, 2015, the polls again got it wrong. And there was again a lot of discussion about what's going to happen in a hung parliament and whether or not the Labour Party would do a deal with the SNP, et cetera, et cetera. And the polls got quite a lot of criticism for that. So it's certainly not unprecedented that the polls shape the campaign.
But the polls don't have to be wrong to shape the campaign, do they, John? I'm struck by the fact it's sometimes things that don't happen that matter. The fact that Rishi Sunak seemed to be quite successful in that first debate and had that £2,000 tax charge and went on about it, had the polls moved even 1 or 2 points in the Conservatives' favour, I think the narrative would have been, you say it's working and people are worried about tax. The fact that nothing happened to Tory support, if anything, it went down rather than up, then shaped a narrative of, Sunak can't get anything right.
Well, sure. But of course, that just simply fed into the fact that the evidence of the opinion polls in the run-up to the election, that neither of the 2 tax cuts that have been introduced, the cuts in national insurance, moved the polls either. So in a sense, that was simply a confirmation of what we already knew. And in a sense, for those of us who've been watching this story, made it rather curious that the Conservative Party thought that promising a 3rd tax cut would have more impact than the 2 that had already actually been delivered. But sure, polls don't have to be wrong to influence the narrative. But in any case, what's also very clear about this general election is that what the polls are saying is certainly being reflected, as you're reporting today, has been reported before, in where the leaders are going. Rishi Sunak is primarily spending his time in what would normally be regarded as safe Conservative constituencies. The Labour Party are focusing their effort on what sometimes would be regarded as constituencies that are beyond their reach. That presumably tells me that the political parties in their own private polling are not getting a different message from the public polls. Now, maybe all the polls are wrong, but I'm afraid that the parties are simply apparently agreeing with the message in terms of the way in which they've decided to organise their campaign.
For people who think that the polls have had too much influence on this campaign, what would you say to them? Has there been an excess of influence of the opinion polls? And if so, where's that come from?
The polls have clearly provided a frame through which people interpret this election, but that's not simply a consequence of the polls during the campaign. That is a consequence of the polls throughout the whole of this parliament, which basically have told us that there are 2 crucial events that have shaped the public's attitude towards the government and then conversely given the Labour Party their opportunity. One is Boris Johnson and Partygate, and the second is Liz Truss and her fiscal event. Those two events saw Conservative support basically fall by about 6 points in 6 weeks. And those are the two crucial things that have defined where we are at now. Now, so unless you are basically saying that opinion polls should never be taken, frankly, that is ended up being what has shaped this campaign, has influenced people's attitude to this campaign, has helped to shape party strategy. So that, I think it's not just the campaign polls. The campaign polls have just basically saying nothing has really changed so far as that gap between Labour and the Conservatives is concerned. So point one. Point two, I would say that actually, I think that what's been intriguing about this election, it's not actually the polls that's simply dominating it, it's the election has actually sometimes struggled to hit the top of the headlines. I suspect that when we get to the end of this election, we will discover that there have been more news bulletins on the Today programme and elsewhere where the lead story has not been the election. Look indeed at some of the material that you, Gov, have pointed out. I mean, the death of Michael Mosley, the search for the poor boy who's lost on a Greek island.
The Euro football championships, of course.
European football champions. Princess Anne. Now these have all, and I think our election campaigns are now longer. The law is such that we've got to have 25 working days, and then you get a little bit to the washout for Parliament. I think the parties have struggled to fill the 25 days, that basically they were so keen to get all their proposals out before their manifestos were published. So when their manifestos were published, we didn't learn anything new. And frankly, the parties have had nothing new to say since then. So in a sense, the parties themselves have created a vacuum, which has been partly, yes, maybe filled by polls, but also filled by lots of other news stories.
Quite reasonable for Britain's most...
The public might be quite happy and find acceptable.
John, thank you so much for joining us on the Today podcast. We're looking forward to seeing you on election night. Those of us who did get to stay up all night. See you then.
You're doing the radio, are you, Nick?
I'm doing the radio. You're on the telly and the radio, and frankly, everything else, to be honest.
How do you keep going? Do you have a sort of supply of Snickers bars, sugar, fizzy drinks?
No. My partly is bad for you anyway. Water and bananas, I would say. But basically, the answer, Amol, is it's a combination of fear, trepidation, and interest. In the end, what you're trying to do, I mean, the big challenge to all of us who are broadcasting about this election is, we've got these results coming in. What do they mean? And trying to explain to people what they might mean in terms of where we might end up in a few hours' time, because that, of course, is what everybody knows. That can be quite a difficult task, and I suspect, given the way in which this electoral system may play tricks on us, that may prove to be a particularly difficult task this time around.
Now, the last time I did Through the Night for the local elections, I tried to follow the example of the great Sir John and brought in a whole bunch of healthy goodies, fruit,
like
edamame beans. I posted it on Instagram, and the main reaction I got is, what the hell are those?
Yeah, do you think you need to explain what edamame beans are? There's little green capsules that you get with your sushi if you're lucky.
Yeah, well, they're like peas, aren't they? You shell them, but you eat them raw. And I didn't eat any of them. All that happened is Rachel Burton kept looking at me, looking at her chocolate and going, can I have some of that? So I ended up eating her chocolate and biscuits instead.
What's your preferred chocolate?
This is Amol, who thinks he's on Grange Hill.
No.
He'd go to the tuck shop.
I used to be a food critic, don't you know?
Yeah.
Those were the days.